In this video, we're going to be talking about how to prep materials to get your students ready for sewing. The big thing for me that I've learned is having your students practice as much as they can with threading needles and tying knots. There are so many knots that need to be tied when you're sewing. First time I taught sewing, I had threaded all of the needles and knotted them all, and I was so proud of myself. And then I quickly realized as all the kids ran out of thread at the same time that I didn't teach them what to do next. So their independence is very important in this project. You want your students to feel confident so that they don't feel overwhelmed and so you don't feel overwhelmed either. So the basics are you're gonna measure, cut, thread, and knot. We have a download for you on how to make a quilter's knot. The quilter's knot is something that a wonderful parent volunteer taught me, and now it's my go-to knot to teach. So you can look that up yourself. I'm gonna demonstrate it here for you. So when we thread, you're putting one end of the thread through the eye of the needle and then matching the two up. Now for this, I happen to be using embroidery floss, so that way it's easier for you to see. When we get to this point, I tell my students to point these ends at each other. So they're pointing the ends of the thread at the point of the needle, and then they're going to stack. So you're stacking the ends over the eye of the needle, and then you grab, wrap. Now with regular thread, which is what we usually use, you're having to wrap numerous times, like 7 is usually the number I tell my students. Embroidery floss is much thicker, so you can see you really don't need to wrap very many times. Then you slide it towards your pinched fingers. Your other hand is completely free now to grab the needle, and you just pinch and pull off. So it ends in a knot almost every single time. It works really good for your students because it's something that they can do independently. There's a lot of different ways for you to demo it, whether you can do it in person or on camera and make a video demo or have a handout so that your students can see it. Sometimes they're going to need to see it more than once. All right, let's now talk about some common mistakes. So as somebody who has sewn with students for a while, I've learned quite a bit about the do's and do nots. So one thing is when students measure their thread, I tell them they're supposed to measure their wingspan. So wingspan is taking your hands out, stretching them wide like a bird, and that's how long your thread should be. But sometimes students see that they only need to do a few stitches, so then they cut a really short piece of thread and it ends up being not enough and they get frustrated. So I always tell them I'd rather have you have too much thread than not enough thread in those situations. Another thing is with the knot tying, if they forget to hold the ends to the needle and they're just here winding it going, I'm wrapping, is not going to make the knot, unfortunately. So if you see that students are just winding it around and they're feeling frustrated because it's not making a knot, back it up, tell them to make sure that they have that end grabbed, makes like an O shape, and then they should be able to wind it correctly. Another common mistake is having students do too wide of stitches, especially with the running stitch. They'll make a really long running stitch and they get all the way done with their project and there's like 6 stitches. And so I tell them, okay, well, let's take a look at it. We stuff it and oh, it's starting to come apart. So it's a good lesson that the shorter, neater, slower stitches are actually the way to finish your project. Other small issues and things that I've learned, cutting the needle off before knotting. So as you are sewing something, you need the needle to tie the knot. And it seems like, I don't know, it just maybe seems counterintuitive, but it actually is how it's done and it works perfectly. So you need to make sure that your students are not cutting their needle off and bringing it to you and asking you to tie it. They also sometimes will sew right up to the edge and then there's no thread left, and then they said, can you please tie my knot? And they said, there's no thread. So you want to leave 3 or 4 lengths of the needle so that you can do the correct knot. Again, yes, you have a little bit of waste, but it's much better. You need that much to do it. And one of the last things is when they sew, they get in such a rhythm that they accidentally get really close to the end and go, oops, I need to leave room for stuffing, and they leave a gap like this big. So I always recommend that my students leave a sewing stuffing gap about the size of their hand. That way they can stick their little hand in and stuff it quite easily. Next, we're going to be talking about different stitches to teach.